Good evening, everyone. Well, it's evening here anyway, at 7 p.m. I hope everyone's doing well tonight. Tonight we are going to read through chapter 28 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. We're not just reading the words. We will stop and talk about vocabulary words that you're probably not familiar with, or phrases that maybe you think you understand but you don't. If you're watching this live with me, then I encourage you to ask questions in the chat and make comments in the chat as we go. That's what makes it interesting, talking about the content that we're reading. So definitely do that if you're watching live. If you don't ask questions, then I will only stop when there's a word I think you probably don't know, or a word that I think is probably useful for you. All right, so let's read chapter 28, Mr. Micawber's Gauntlet. What is a gauntlet? There's an expression which means to throw down the gauntlet, which means to challenge someone. It's not really an expression that I use, but let's take a look at it. First of all, this is referring, I think, to the phrase throw down the gauntlet. So let's look at that phrase first. Throw down gauntlet, meaning to challenge or to confront someone. But let's see, what really is a gauntlet? Oh, Irma's here, but Irma, it's the middle of the night. It's like 2 o'clock in the morning, right? Are you a vampire? Well, let's see what gauntlet means. So that is an expression. To throw down the gauntlet means to create a challenge for someone. So the title of this chapter, Mr. Micawber's Gauntlet, sounds like Mr. Micawber now has a challenge that he must confront. But I don't know what a gauntlet is, so let's take a look. A glove worn with medieval armor to protect the hand. Maybe we'll look at a picture. So maybe throwing down the gauntlet means, okay, no more protection, let's fight. Maybe you could think of it that way. This is what gauntlet is, the gloves that a knight would wear. Okay. Until the day arrived on which I was to entertain my newly found old friends, I lived principally on Dora and coffee. In my love-lorn condition, my appetite languished. To languish, I think that means like to like die. Let's see, languish. Something about dying or starting to die. Lose vitality, grow weak, grow feeble. My appetite languished. Appetite is how much food you want to eat. So if you have a big appetite, you like to eat a lot of food. If you have a small appetite, you don't really like to eat too much food. So when he says my appetite languished, that means the amount of food, the desire for food became very small. In my love-lorn condition, my appetite languished, and I was glad of it, for I felt as though it would have been an act of perfidy towards Dora to have a natural relish for my dinner. Okay, we have to look up the word perfidy. Perfidy. Deceitfulness, untrustworthiness. So he thinks it would have been a lie. Let's see, how does that fit? For I felt as though it would have been an act of perfidy, like a lie. It would have been a lie towards Dora to have a natural relish for my dinner. To relish something means to enjoy something. So if you relish your dinner, you're not just eating your dinner, you're enjoying it. It's so delicious. That's a relish. And so he's saying he was glad that he didn't feel like eating because it would have been like cheating on Dora if he had enjoyed eating. The quantity of walking exercise I took was not in this respect attended with its usual consequence, as the disappointment counteracted the fresh air. I have my doubts, too, founded on the acute experience acquired at this period of my life. Whether a sound enjoyment of animal food can develop itself freely in any human subject who is always in torment from tight boots, I think the extremities require to be at peace before the stomach will conduct itself with vigor. Davy's feeling very self-conscious because now he's in love with Dora, and he bought some new fancy clothes. He bought some fancy boots, but they don't fit him very well. They're very tight and uncomfortable. And he's saying maybe that's part of the reason why I'm not hungry, because I'm walking around in these boots which hurt my feet all day. How can I think about enjoying food? Irma is asking about torment. Torment is like torture, if you know that word. And if you don't know that word, oh wow. I don't know what kind of pictures we'll get if I Google torture, but let's see. Okay, good. They're safe. You never know. Okay, so this is torment or torture. Intentionally hurting someone to cause pain, to try to make people feel pain. How did they use it here? Whether a sound enjoyment of animal food can develop itself freely in any human subject who is always in torment from tight boots. So he bought these expensive boots to look fancy, but they don't fit him. They're very tight. They're very uncomfortable. So he is always in torment. His boots are tormenting him. I think the extremities, when he says extremities, he means the arms and the legs. That's what extremities mean. The extremities require to be at peace before the stomach will conduct itself with vigor. So you need to feel relaxed. Your arms and legs should feel nice and relaxed before you can really enjoy eating. On the occasion of this domestic little party, I did not repeat my former extensive preparations. When he gave his first dinner party, he went, there's an expression, to go all out. That means to spend a lot of money, to pay attention to every detail. Really, it means to spend a lot of money. He went all out on his first dinner party. And now he's saying, this time I didn't do that. I didn't spend a lot of money. I didn't do anything extreme. I merely provided a pair of soles, a small leg of mutton, and a pigeon pie. Mrs. Krupp broke out into rebellion on my first bashful hint. In reference to the cooking of the fish and joint, and said with a dignified sense of injury, "No, sir, no. You will not ask me such a thing, for you are better acquainted with me than to suppose me capable of doing what I cannot do with ample satisfaction to my own feelings." So Davy asked Mrs. Krupp, the landlady, to prepare the dinner for him. And she said, "I can't. You know I'm no good at cooking. Don't ask me to cook." Really, she doesn't want to. She's just being lazy. But that's her excuse. No, go and buy it. Go pay someone for it, because if I do it, it will be horrible. Ampial, Irma's asking about ampial. There's a word ample, which means sufficient. And I think maybe this is just an older version of that, but let me see. Ampial. Actually, if you Google ampial, the thing that comes up is this exact line from the book. So Mrs. Krupp speaks a little bit strangely. I think it's just her way of saying ample. A-M-P-L-E. Let me put that up here for a minute, because that's actually a word that we use. Ample is another word for sufficient, if you're familiar with that word, sufficient. The meal was ample. It was sufficient. It satisfied. We can go see a movie if we have ample time. We can go see a movie if we have enough time, sufficient time. Ample means enough, sufficient. And Mrs. Krupp just speaks a little bit strangely. But in the end, a compromise was effected, and Mrs. Krupp consented to achieve this feat, on the condition that I dined from home for a fortnight afterwards. Fortnight means 14 nights. A fortnight means 2 weeks. And here I may remark that I underwent from Mrs. Krupp in consequence of the tyranny she established over me was dreadful. I never was so much afraid of anyone. We made a compromise of everything, if I hesitated. I lost my place. We made a compromise of everything, if I hesitated. She was taken with that wonderful disorder, which was always lying in ambush in her system. An ambush is like a secret attack, something waiting to attack. Let's see what kind of pictures we get with ambush. Oh no, it's the name of a movie and a shoe. So all we get are pictures of movies and shoes. But here, look at these soldiers. See, they're just waiting, they're hiding, waiting to attack, waiting to jump. That's an ambush. A surprise attack. So Mrs. Krupp has this imaginary illness. What did she call it? I can't remember. It's a funny name that she gave it. But so she's always got that. When Davy asks her for a favor, she says, "Oh, I would love to, but I can't remember what she called her imaginary sickness." Maybe they'll mention it again. So her sickness is always there in ambush if Davy wants something. "Oh, I would love to, but..." And then she uses it. If I hesitated, she was taken with that wonderful disorder, which was always lying in ambush in her system, ready, at the shortest notice, to prey upon her vitals. If I rang the bell impatiently after half a dozen times, unavailing modest pulls, and she appeared at last, which was not by any means to be relied upon, she would appear with a reproachful aspect. Remember, reproach means when you're telling someone they're doing something wrong, you're reproaching them. Don't do that. That's bad. You're doing something bad. That's reproaching someone. So Davy would ring the bell for her to come up for food or tea or whatever. He would have to ring the bell many times before she would come. And when she did come, she was reproachful. "What do you want? Why do you keep bothering me? It's not right." sink breathless on a chair near the door, lay her hand upon her Nanking bosom, and become so ill that I was glad at any sacrifice of brandy or anything to get rid of her. So if she finally did come, she would say, oh, those stairs, and she would sit in one of his chairs until Davy gave her some alcohol. Irma is asking about bosom, at Nanking bosom. Okay, this is your bosom. This area of your body is your bosom. And I think this Nanking, maybe it comes from the place in China, Nanking. It's probably a style of clothing for a woman. Let me see. Well, there aren't many pictures, but I think it's just the way... I think it's just a style of dress that women wore at this time. I mean, when I Google Nanking bosom, I get men's clothes. But maybe it's this, you see this is the bosom up here, so maybe it's the way that this collar is. I don't really know what the, Nanking is a place in China, so maybe they copied that style from Chinese dress back when they made these clothes. And so they called it a Nanking bosom. That's it. There really aren't any. What is this? No. That's the only hint. So she would lay her hand upon her Nanking bosom. So I think, lay her hand here, but it was the style of her clothes that he's referring to. And become so ill that I was glad at any sacrifice of brandy or anything else to get rid of her. So she would go there supposedly to serve him, but she would sit down and say, oh, until Davy gave her some brandy, some alcohol. And then she would have some drinks, and then she would be okay and leave without doing anything. If I objected to having my bed made at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, which I do still think an uncomfortable arrangement, one motion of her hand towards the same Nanking region of wounded sensibility was enough to make me falter an apology. In short, I would have done anything in an honorable way rather than give Mrs. Krupp offense, and she was the terror of my life. I bought a second-hand dumbwaiter for this dinner party, in preference to re-engaging the handy young man, against whom I had conceived a prejudice, in consequence of meeting him in the Strand one Sunday morning, in a waistcoat remarkably like one of mine, which had been missing since the former occasion. So in the first dinner party Davy gave, it was a disaster. Well, they had a great time. They had a lot of fun. But he hired one man to serve the dinner, and he hired a girl to wash all of the dishes, make sure everything was clean. And they both did a horrible job. Davy could see that the man was in the kitchen, in the pantry, drinking all the alcohol, getting drunk, and the girl was breaking everything. It was really horrible from that perspective. And Davy saying, I decided instead of hiring someone again, like last time, which was a disaster, I bought a dumbwaiter. Now, to me, dumbwaiter. Dumb, you probably know that word dumb, D-U-M-B, meaning stupid, D-U-M-B. That's a word for stupid, dumb. And when I think of the word dumbwaiter, I always think of this. But dumb really, the original meaning of dumb means can't talk. Can't talk. People don't really use it that way anymore. Now it only means stupid. But it used to mean can't talk, silent. So a dumb waiter is like a waiter, but it doesn't talk. And when I think of a dumb waiter, I think of something like this. But I think maybe Davy bought a cart, like a serving cart. Maybe something like this. Let's see. So maybe he's calling this a dumb waiter. Technically, that could be true. It's like a silent waiter. So he said, instead of hiring a guy like that last time, I bought a dumb waiter so I could just serve the food myself. And he said actually that one time he was walking in London and he saw the waiter, this horrible waiter, after this party. And the waiter was wearing clothes that looked just like his clothes he hadn't seen since that day. So he thinks that this guy also stole some of his clothes. The young gal was re-engaged. Okay, maybe you don't know this word gal, but you probably know the word guy. What does guy mean? Guy is kind of a funny word for a man, like fellow or something like that. It's like another word for man. And the female version of guy is gal. So that's just another way of saying girl, gal. And it's still common. People say it. I say it sometimes, mostly to be funny, mostly because I think it's a funny word. But you'll definitely see it and hear it. So the young gal, that's the girl that he hired before to wash the dishes and broke everything. The young gal was re-engaged, but on the stipulation that she should only bring in dishes, and then withdrew to the landing place beyond the outer door, where the habit of sniffing she had contracted would be lost upon the guests, and where her retiring on the plates would be a physical impossibility. So he hired the washing girl again, but he said, you only, what did he say, only take the plates or bring the plates? So only to serve. So the girl was hired again just to serve the dinner, not to take anything because she broke everything last time. So he said, I'll hire you again, but you just bring the food to the table. And after that, go into the hallway where no one can see or hear you. And don't try to wash anything. Having laid in the materials for a bowl of punch to be compounded by Mr. Micawber, having provided a bottle of lavender water, 2 wax candles, a paper of mixed pins, and a pincushion to assist Mrs. Micawber in her toilette at my dressing table, having also caused the fire in my bedroom to be lighted for Mrs. Micawber's convenience, and having laid the cloth with my own hands, I awaited the result with composure. Remember, to be composed means to stand or to sit without showing any emotion. So he waited with composure. He just sat there. He didn't look at his, well, they didn't have wristwatches back then, but he wasn't nervous. He wasn't fidgeting. He wasn't doing things. He just sat with composure, not showing any emotions. At the appointed time, my 3 visitors arrived together. Mr. Micawber, with more shirt collar than usual, and a new ribbon to his eyeglass. Mrs. Micawber, with her cap, a whitey brown paper parcel. Traddles, carrying the parcel and supporting Mrs. Micawber on his arm. They were all delighted with my residence. When I conducted Mrs. Micawber to my dressing table, and she saw the scale on which it was prepared for her, she was in such raptures, that means she was very happy, she was very impressed, that she called Mr. Micawber to come and look at it. My dear Copperfield, said Mr. Micawber, this is luxurious. This is a way of life which reminds me of the period when I was myself in a state of celibacy. and Mrs. Micawber had not yet been solicited to plight her faith at the hymnal altar. So all that means in Mr. Micawber talk is, oh, this is very nice. I haven't seen anything this nice since I was single before I got married. That's all that means. He means solicited by him, Mr. Copperfield, said Mrs. Micawber archly. He cannot answer for others. My dear, returned Mr. Micawber with sudden seriousness, I have no desire to answer for others. I am too well aware that when, in the inscrutable decrees of fate, you were reserved for me, it is possible you may have been reserved for one, destined, after a protracted struggle, at length to fall a victim to pecuniary involvements of a complicated nature. I understand your allusion, my love. I regret it, but I can bear it. Oh, wait a minute. Irma's saying, make the text bigger. Let's see. Hopefully this is better. Can you see? It's about as big as I can get it. Micawber, exclaimed Mrs. Micawber in tears. Have I deserved this? Irma's asking about the word protracted. Where did that occur? After a protracted struggle. To protract means to go back. Well, I better look that up. Protract. Oh, you see, I'm wrong. Because it means for a long time. After a long time. But a normal person will say after a long time. That's Mr. Micawber's very strange person. He likes to use these crazy words all the time. So, after a protracted struggle, after a very long struggle. Micawber, exclaimed Mrs. Micawber in tears, have I deserved this? I, who never have deserted you, who never will desert you, Micawber, my love, said Mr. Micawber, much affected. You will forgive, and our old and tried friend Copperfield will, I am sure, forgive the momentary laceration of wounded spirit, made sensitive by a recent collision with the minion of power. In other words, with a ribald turnock attached to the waterworks, and will pity, not condemn, its excesses. It's very complicated. I really don't understand what he's saying myself here. It's too crazy. The momentary... So he's saying, please forgive me for that I hurt your feelings this one time. Just this once. Made sensitive by a recent collision with the minion of power. In other words, with a ribald turnock attached to the waterworks, and will pity, not... I really don't understand that last part. Don't ask me. I don't know. Mr. Micawber then embraced Mrs. Micawber and pressed my hand, leaving me to infer from this broken allusion that his domestic supply of water had been cut... Oh, it's literal. It's literal. They turned off his water because he didn't pay the bills. I didn't know that they had indoor plumbing in that must be like the 1840s or 1830s. So I'm surprised by that. I wasn't even thinking that. I thought he was making some kind of weird reference I didn't understand. So Mr. Micawber is saying, oh, I'm sorry I hurt your feelings. That was the thing that was confusing me. He's saying, I'm sorry I hurt your feelings. It's just that, I'm so upset because they shut off the water. They turned off the water today. So I'm a little insensitive and I'm sorry. Mr. Micawber then embraced Mrs. Micawber and pressed my hand, leaving me to infer from this broken allusion. See, Davy doesn't understand what he's talking about either. That his domestic supply of water had been cut off. Cut off is a phrasal verb that means stopped. That afternoon, in consequence of default in payment of the company's rates. To divert his thoughts from this melancholy subject, I informed Mr. Micawber that I relied upon him for a bowl of punch, and led him to the lemons. His recent despondency, not to say despair. Irma says, yeah, the water is a surprise to me too. Yeah, I'm very surprised about that. I don't know. That's very interesting. I had no idea. His recent despondency, not to say despair, was gone in a moment. I never saw a man so thoroughly enjoy himself amid the fragrance of lemon peel and sugar, the odor of burning rum, and the steam of boiling water, and Mr. Micawber did that afternoon. It was wonderful to see his face shining at us out of a thin cloud of these delicate fumes. As he stirred, this is stirring. When you're mixing something, you go like this. This is stirring. As he stirred and mixed and tasted, and looked as if he were making, instead of punch, a fortune for his family down to the latest posterity, as to Mrs. Micawber. I don't know whether it was the effect of the cap, or the lavender water, or the pens, or the fire, or the wax candles, but she came out of my room, comparatively speaking, lovely. And the lark was never gayer than the excellent woman. Irma's asking about posterity. Posterity means like your legacy. Wait, let's get a definition of that, posterity. In this case, I think he's talking about his children. All future generations of people. So Mr. Micawber was enjoying so much making this punch with the lemon peels and the sugar and the rum that it looked like he was playing with a pile of money that he was going to be leaving for himself and his children, for his posterity, for his children, for his future incarnations. I suppose I never ventured to inquire, but I suppose that Mrs. Krupp, after frying the soles, was taken ill, because we broke down at that point. The leg of mutton came up very red within and very pale without, besides having a foreign substance of a gritty nature sprinkled over it, as if it had fallen into the ashes of that remarkable kitchen fireplace. But we were not in condition to judge of this fact from the appearance of the gravy, for as much as the young gal had dropped it all upon the stairs. So it seems like Mrs. Krupp, after she did the fried sole is a type of fish. She made the fried sole, and that was fine. But when the mutton came up, it was not cooked in the middle, and it had a weird gray color on the outside. And when they were eating it, there was something gritty. Let me show you the word gritty. Oh no. Gritty is the name of some kind of character, so you just get pictures of this stupid character instead of what gritty means. Let's see, gritty dirt. Let's try gritty dirt. Oh no. It's the name of a rock band, so you just get... Oh, Google's horrible now. It doesn't work anymore, I swear. Gritty sand. How about gritty sand? Okay. This is the texture of grit. The texture of sand. If something is gritty, it has that feeling. It has that feeling in it. Something is gritty, it has the feeling of sand. So the fish was fine. When the fried sole was okay, it was fine. But when the mutton came, it was too red in the middle, and it was kind of a gray, ugly color on the outside. And when they ate it, there was something gritty in it. And Davy thinks that maybe she dropped the meat into the fire. So those are like the ashes from the fire that they're eating. And then there was supposed to be gravy. Do you know what gravy is? Just in case you don't know what gravy is, I better make a picture. Well, thank goodness it's not the name of a band or a product. This is gravy. So that's something that you put on top of your meat, or gravy and potatoes. That's very delicious to have, or biscuits and gravy. That's a very popular American breakfast. I love biscuits and gravy. I haven't had that in years. So there was supposed to be gravy with the meat, but the girl who Davy hired to bring the plates dropped it on the stairs, so there was very little gravy. But we were not in the condition to judge of this fact from the appearance of the gravy, for as much as the young gal had dropped it all on the stairs, where it remained, by the by, in a long train until it was worn out. The pigeon pie was not bad, but it was a delusive pie. What is delusive? These are not common words. These are kind of strange words. Giving a false or misleading impression. So he says it was a delusive pie, which must mean that maybe there wasn't very much pigeon, or maybe it wasn't actually pigeon. Let's see. The pigeon pie was not bad, but it was a delusive pie, so it was a lie. This pie was a lie. The crust being like a disappointing head. Phrenologically speaking, full of lumps and bumps, with nothing particular underneath. In short, the banquet was such a failure that I should have been quite unhappy about the failure. I mean, for I was always unhappy about Dora, if I had not been relieved by the great good humor of my company, and by a bright suggestion from Mr. Micawber. My dear friend Copperfield, said Mr. Micawber, accidents will occur in the best regulated families, and in families not regulated by that pervading influence which sanctifies while it enhances. I would say, in short, by the influence of a woman. So Mr. Micawber is saying, even in the best house, things cannot be perfect unless there is a woman present to, like, if you're having a party or something like that. That's what he's trying to say, that I understand why things are not going well, because only a woman can properly run a house. That's what I think he's saying. In the lofty character of wife, they may be expected with confidence, and must be borne with philosophy. If you will allow me to take the liberty of remarking that there are few comestibles better in their way than a devil, and that, I believe, with a little division of labor, we would accomplish a good one if the young person in attendance could produce a gridiron. I would put it to you that this little misfortune may be easily repaired. Gridiron, let's see. I think it's like a grill. Oh, here's a picture of a gridiron. This is a gridiron. I think it's like a grill. It's either a grill or it's something to put something hot on. Let's see. Let's actually read the definition. So that's a picture of a gridiron. What is a gridiron? Gridiron. The problem is it's used for some kind of sports, so it just gives a definition of sports. Wait, let me see. Yeah, it's like a grill. It's like a grill. And Irma's asking about comestible. Let's see, comestible. These are not real words that you have to worry. They're real words, but they're not words that people ever use. An item of food. There was a gridiron in the pantry on which my morning rasher of bacon was cooked. We had it in. So Mr. Micawber is suggesting maybe we can get the gridiron and we can heat up the food and it will be better. I think that's what he's suggesting. We had it in a twinkling and immediately applied ourselves to carrying Mr. Micawber's idea into effect. The division of labor to which he had referred to was this. Traddles cut the mutton into slices. Mr. Micawber, who could do anything of this sort to perfection, covered them with pepper, mustard, salt, and cayenne. I put them on the gridiron, turned them with a fork, and took them off under Mr. Micawber's direction, and Mrs. Micawber heated and continually stirred some mushroom ketchup in a little saucepan. When we had slices enough done to begin upon, we fell to, with our sleeves still tucked up at the wrist, more slices sputtering and blazing on the fire, and our attention divided between the mutton and the plates and the mutton and then preparing. Yeah, so because the food was undercooked, Davy got out the gridiron and they just cooked it a little bit more with a little bit of seasoning, some pepper and some mustard, and seems like everything turned out very well. With the novelty of this cookery, the excellence of it, the bustle of it, the frequent starting up to look after it, the frequent sitting down to dispose of it, as the crisp slices came off the gridiron, hot and hot. The being so busy, so flushed with the fire, so amused, and in the midst of such a tempting noise and savour, we reduced the leg of mutton to the bone. My own appetite came back miraculously. I am ashamed to record it, but I really believe I forgot Dora for a little while. I'm satisfied that Mr. and Mrs. Micawber could not have enjoyed the feast more, if they had sold a bed to provide it. Traddles laughed as heartily almost the whole time as he ate and worked. Indeed, we all did, all at once, and I dare say there was never a greater success. We were at the height of our enjoyment, and we were all busily engaged in our several departments, endeavoring to bring the last batch of slices to a state of perfection that should crown the feast, when I was aware of the strange presence in the room, and my eyes encountered those of staid Littimer, standing hat in hand before me. Littimer, I think Littimer is Davy's best friend, Steerforth, best friend from school. Steerforth has a servant. I think that's Littimer. And so recently Davy has become suspicious of Steerforth. Like maybe he's not such a good person. And he hasn't talked to Steerforth in a while. And he's happy about that. But Littimer is Steerforth's servant, and suddenly Littimer has appeared at the door of Davy's apartment. H. Rosa says, this is very interesting. Well, I'm glad you like it, H. Rosa. I hope you continue watching, and if you have questions about any of the vocabulary or any of the phrases used, please ask in the comments. That's what we're doing. We're explaining as we go. What's the matter? I involuntarily asked. I beg your pardon, sir. I was directed to come in. Is my master not here, sir? No. Have you not seen him, sir? No. Don't you come from him? Not immediately so, sir. Did he tell you you would find him here? Not exactly so, sir. But I should think he might be here tomorrow, as he has not been here today. Is he coming up from Oxford? I beg, sir, he returns respectfully, that you will be seated and allow me to do this. With which he took the fork from the unresisting hand and bent over the gridiron as if his whole attention were concentrated on it. The thing about Litimer is he's like the perfect servant. He's absolutely perfect in the way that he behaves and talks, and he's very dedicated to his work. He's so perfect that Davy feels nervous around him. He feels uncomfortable because, Davy is supposedly higher socially than Litimer, but Litimer is so much of a perfect person that Davy feels down here in front of him when he should feel here. So he feels very uncomfortable. And he sees that they're cooking the food in the fire, and he says, "Oh, please, please let me serve you. Let me do this for you." We should not have been much discomposed, I dare say, by the appearance of Steerforth himself, but we became in a moment the meekest. Meekest means very, very gentle, very shy. The meekest of the meek before his respectable serving man. Mr. Micawber, humming a tune, humming a tune to show that he was quite at ease, subsided in his chair, with the handle of a hastily concealed fork sticking out of the bosom of his coat. So remember, bosom is this area of the body. So there was a fork sticking out of the bosom of his coat, as if he had stabbed himself. Mrs. Micawber put on her brown gloves and assumed a genteel languor. What is languor? I think we've looked up that word before, but I forgot. I always forget these words. How can you improve your vocabulary if I can't even remember the words? Lack of energy, vitality. So she's kind of no energy, feeling lazy, and no interest. Traddles ran his greasy hands through his hair and stood it bolt upright, and stared in confusion on the tablecloth. As for me, I was a mere infant at the head of my own table, and hardly ventured to glance at the respectable phenomenon, who had come from heaven knows where to put my establishment to rights. Meanwhile, he took the mutton off the gridiron and gravely handed it round. We all took some, but our appreciation of it was gone. So they were having a great time earlier. They were slicing and seasoning and cooking and checking and having conversation. It was a lot of fun making the food. But now Litimer came in and he said, oh no, you shouldn't. Let me serve the dinner. Let me take care of all of this. And now, it's nice. He's serving the food, but it's not fun anymore. We all took some, but our appreciation of it was gone, and we merely made a show of eating it. As we severally pushed away our plates, he noiselessly removed them and set on the cheese. He took that off too when it was done with, cleared the table, piled everything on a dumbwaiter, gave us our wine glasses of his own accord. When somebody does something of their own accord, it means you don't have to ask them to do it. They just do it. So he brought the wine glasses of his own accord. They didn't say, "Litimer, can we please have our wine now?" They didn't have to. He did it automatically, without being asked. He did it of his own accord. All of this was done in a perfect manner, and he never raised his eyes from what he was about. Yes, his very elbows, when he had his back towards me, seemed to teem with the expression of his fixed opinion that I was extremely young. So Davy always feels very uncomfortable, very young and inexperienced around Litimer the servant. "Can I do anything more, sir?" I thanked him and said no, but would he take no dinner himself? "None, I am obliged to you, sir. Is Mr. Steerforth coming from Oxford?" "I beg your pardon, sir. Is Mr. Steerforth coming from Oxford?" "I should imagine that he might be here tomorrow, sir. I rather thought he might have been here today, sir. The mistake is mine, no doubt, sir." "If you should see him first," said I. "If you'll excuse me, sir, I don't think I shall see him first." "In case you do," I said, "pray say that I am sorry he was not here today, as an old schoolfellow of his was here." "Indeed, sir." He divided a bow between me and Traddles with a glance at the latter. He was moving softly to the door, when in a forlorn hope of saying something naturally, which I never could, to this man, I said, "Oh, Litimer." "Sir." "Sir." "Did you remain long at Yarmouth that time?" "Not particularly so, sir." "You saw the boat completed?" "Yes, sir. I remained behind on purpose to see the boat completed." "I know." He raised his eyes to mine respectfully. "Mr. Steerforth has not seen it yet, I suppose?" "I really can't say, sir, I think. But I really can't say, sir. I wish you good night, sir." Well, if this is your first time watching, in an earlier chapter, when Davy had a very difficult time growing up. His father died before he was born, and his mother was very, very young when he was born, and single, because a widow, because his father died. And so, but they had some money, so that was okay. But his mother wasn't easy for her to raise Davy, and there was a nursemaid, like a servant in the house where Davy was born, an old lady, a big fat old lady named Peggotty. And so Peggotty is kind of like his grandmother. She really was the person who raised him. And his mother went through some very difficult times. She remarried a man who was very abusive to both her and to Davy. Actually, he probably killed the mother. Not killed her, but she died of a depression and broken heart because they were so cruel to her. And during some difficult times, Davy went to spend time at Peggotty's family's house in Yarmouth, which is a fishing town. And he loved it there. It was a wonderful time. And he fell in love with Emily, which was kind of like an adopted daughter of Peggotty's brother. He was staying with Peggotty's brother. And little Emily is not his real daughter, but was kind of an adopted daughter. And they're the same age. And he fell in love with her. And so he loves that place. He loves Peggotty's family. He loves to go there. And when he was older, when he was deciding, when he finished school and he thought, what should I do for my career? His aunt told him, go to Yarmouth, go visit Peggotty, stay there for a while, and think about what you want to do with your life. And he said, that's a great idea. And the first thing he did was he stopped in London, and this is where he met Steerforth, who was an old school friend of his. I can't believe I know all the details of David Copperfield's life. It's crazy. But so that's the first time they saw each other in 10 years. They hadn't seen each other since they were little boys. And he said, hey, come to Yarmouth with me. And Steerforth said, okay, yeah, I'll come with you. And they had a great time. And while they were there, Steerforth really enjoyed being at sea and having being on a boat. So he bought a boat, but obviously he wasn't going to use it. So he lets Peggotty's brother use it. So that's what Davy's asking about. Were you there when the boat was ready to go out for the first time? And Littimer says, yes, I was there. I stayed just for that reason. And he said, was Steerforth there? And I think, didn't Littimer say no? No, he wasn't there. So he bought the boat, which is kind of strange, but he didn't even wait to see it go out for the first time. Okay, I'm only explaining this to you because it's kind of important. It will become important later in the story. Okay, let me see. I lost my place now. So Mr. Steerforth had not yet seen it, I suppose. He hasn't seen the boat. I really can't say, sir. I think a good servant will never reveal any information about the person that they work for. So that probably means no, he hasn't seen it. But he can't say that. He says, I really can't say. But I really can't say, sir. I wish you good night, sir. He comprehended everybody present in the respectful bow with which he followed these words and disappeared. My visitors seemed to breathe more freely when he was gone, but my own relief was very great, for besides the constraint arising from that extraordinary sense of being at a disadvantage which I always had in this man's presence, my conscience had embarrassed me with whispers that I had mistrusted his master. So Davy's feeling guilty because recently he's beginning to think bad things about Steerforth. Like maybe Steerforth is a bad person. And he's feeling guilty about that, especially talking to his servant. And I could not repress a vague, uneasy dread that he might find it out. So to feel dread is to feel scared that something is going to happen. So Davy is scared that one day Steerforth is going to know that Davy has been thinking really bad things about him. How was it, having so little in reality to conceal, that I always did feel as if this man were finding me out? Mr. Micawber roused me from this reflection, which was blended with a certain remorseful apprehension of seeing Steerforth himself, by bestowing many encomiums on the absent Littimer. Encomium, okay. Let's figure out what that word means. Irma's asking, encomiums? Yeah, I don't know either. Encomiums. It's not an important word, trust me. Encomiums, a speech or piece of writing that praises someone or something highly. So Mr. Micawber started saying, oh, what a wonderful person Littimer is. And as a most respectable fellow, and a thoroughly admirable servant, Mr. Micawber, I may remark, had taken his full share of the general bow, and had received it with infinite condescension. To condescend to someone means to look down on them. Mr. Micawber, it's obvious that Mr. Micawber wants to feel superior to everyone. That's why he uses this very strange language when he talks. And that's true of people even now. When you see a person using a lot of very strange words, a lot of times you could get the impression that they want to feel superior to you. Look at all these words that I know. It's pretty annoying sometimes when people do that. I don't know if that works in your language the same way. But in English, there are hundreds of thousands of words that people don't know. And if you use those words, yes, they're words, and yes, you can use them, but if you use them You'll confuse people. They won't understand what you mean because, a regular person probably uses only about 5,000 or 6,000 words maximum in their lives. So it's weird when people want to use these strange words that no one knows. And it tells other people, I want to feel smarter than you. So that's like condescending to someone. I'm smarter than you. So Mr. Micawber is the kind of person who enjoys that. He wants to feel better and superior to other people. That's why he uses that weird language all the time. He thinks it makes him look better than everyone else. So when there's this very impressive, perfect servant, Litimer, saying goodbye and bowing, you can see Mr. Micawber enjoying it, being superior to this man. Which is funny because Davy feels inferior to the servant because he's such a perfect servant. But Mr. Micawber loves it. He enjoys every second of it. But punch, my dear Copperfield, said Mr. Micawber, tasting it, like time and tide, waits for no man. Ah, it is at present moment in high flavour, my love. Will you give me your opinion? Mrs. Micawber pronounced it excellent. Then I will drink, said Mr. Micawber, if my friend Copperfield will permit me to take that social liberty, to the days when my friend Copperfield and myself were younger, and fought our way in the world side by side. I may say of myself and Copperfield, in words we have sung together before now, that we twa hae run about the braes and pooed the goings fine. I have no idea. Let's see. That's either Scottish, that's some kind of Scottish English, or it's Old English. I'm not sure. Let's see. We twa hae run. Let's see. Oh, okay, yes. There's an old song. I just don't know all the words to it, but these must be part of the words. You probably have heard it because it's a very popular song to sing around New Year's. May old acquaintance be forgot, da 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 da. The name of the song is Old Lang Syne, and I think the words are Scottish. So this is some kind of Scottish, and I have no idea what it means. In a figurative point of view, on several occasions, I'm not exactly aware, said Mr. Micawber, with the old roll in his voice and the old indescribable air of saying something genteel, what gowans may be. Okay. So even Mr. Micawber is saying, I don't know what these words mean. Well, let's read that again. I am not exactly aware, said Mr. Micawber, with the old roll in his voice and the old indescribable air of saying something genteel, what gowans may be, but I have no doubt that Copperfield and myself would frequently have taken a pull at them if it had been feasible. So Mr. Micawber is saying, I don't know what gowans are, but I bet we would have enjoyed them if we had them. Okay, Mr. Micawber at the then present moment took a pull at his punch. So we all did. Traddles, evidently lost and wondering at what distant time Mr. Micawber and I could have been comrades in the battle of the world. Ahem, said Mr. Micawber, clearing his throat. When you clear your throat, that's that's clearing your throat. Ahem, that's clearing your throat. And warming with the punch and with the fire, my dear, another glass? Mrs. Micawber said it must be very little, but we couldn't allow that, so it was a glassful. As we are quite confidential here, Mr. Copperfield, said Mrs. Micawber, sipping his little drinks. That's sipping. Sipping her punch. Mr. Traddles being a part of our domesticity, I should like to have your opinion on Mr. Micawber's prospects for corn, said Mrs. Micawber, argumentatively, as I have repeatedly said to Mr. Micawber, may be gentlemanly, but it is not so remunerative. So Mrs. Micawber is saying, what do you think about Mr. Micawber having a business with corn? It's good in the sense that it's a nice high status position, but he's not making any money. Commission to the extent of 2 and 9 in a fortnight cannot, however, limited our ideas, be considered remunerative. Then we are all agreed upon that. Then, said Mrs. Micawber, we are all agreed upon that. Then, said Mrs. Micawber, who prided herself on taking a clear view of things and keeping Mr. Micawber straight by her woman's wisdom, when he might otherwise go a little crooked. Crooked, let's look at the word crooked. That's a good word. Gosh, I hope it's not the name of something for sale. Otherwise, there won't be any pictures of it. Okay, look at this tree. You expect a tree to be like this, straight up and down. So this is a crooked tree. Let's see what other kind of things that we can find that are crooked. Wait, I have to move this off to the side for a minute. Oh, look at this. You would expect this building, you would expect the building to be straight like this, level, but it's not. It's crooked. Let's see if we can find, some crooked teeth. You want the teeth to be very straight, very neat, but if they're not neat, then they are crooked teeth. Crooked teeth. Okay, well, I guess you get the... Here's another thing. Look at this crooked building. That's in France. A crooked building in France. Okay, I guess you probably get the idea of crooked by now. How do they use crooked here? Let's see. Then, said Mrs. Micawber, keeping Mr. Micawber straight by her own woman's wisdom when he might otherwise go a little crooked. So Mrs. Micawber is very sensible, and she's trying to keep Mr. Micawber on a direct path to making money or being practical. But unfortunately, he always likes to go crooked. Then I ask myself this question. If corn is not to be relied upon, what is? Are coals to be relied upon? Not at all. We have turned our attention to that experiment on the suggestion of my family, and we find it fallacious. Mr. Micawber, leaning back in his chair with his hands in his pockets, eyed us aside. So Mr. Micawber's like this, but he's looking over at them while they're talking about him. And nodded his head, as much as to say that the case was very clearly put. So he knows that Mrs. Micawber is right about this. He agrees with her. The articles of corn and coals, said Mrs. Micawber, still more argumentatively, being equally out of the question, Mr. Copperfield, I naturally look around the world and say, what is there in which a person of Mr. Micawber's talent is likely to succeed? And I exclude the doing anything on commission. Because commission is not a certainty. Do you know what a commission is? That's like, instead of being paid every hour, I'll pay you 20 euros per hour to work in my store. A commission is, I will pay you 15% of what you sell. So if you sell 100 euros, I will pay you 15 euros. That's what a commission is. And so Mrs. Micawber is saying it's not good to work on commission because it's not predictable, it's not reliable. You never know if you're going to make any money. Because commission is not a certainty. What is best suited to a person of Mr. Micawber's peculiar temperament, I am convinced, a certainty. So she's saying Mr. Micawber needs a schedule. He needs a structure. That's what she's saying. Traddles and I both expressed by a feeling of murmur that this great discovery was no doubt true of Mr. Micawber, and that it did him much credit. To murmur is to talk very unclearly. That's murmuring. So when Mrs. Micawber said, Mr. Micawber needs certainty, Traddles and Davy said, like that. They murmured. They agreed by murmuring. Traddles and I both, by a feeling of murmur, that this great discovery was no doubt true of Mr. Micawber. And it did him much credit. I will not conceal from you, my dear Copperfield, said Mrs. Micawber, that I have long felt the brewing business to be particularly adapted to Mr. Micawber. Do you know what brewing is? Do you know that word brewing? Let's take a look at brewing for a minute. Brewing is when you apply heat to something usually to make a drink. I guess it could be other things, but if you want to make tea or coffee, the way that you do it is you have to heat water, put the tea or coffee in the water and let it sit, and this process is called brewing. But I don't think that's what Mrs. Micawber means. I think that what she's talking about is beer. So if I just put brewing here, what you'll find mostly are pictures of making beer. So the process of making beer is called brewing beer. The place where they make beer is called a brewery. That's a very hard word to say. Brewery. Brewery. A beer brewery. Microbreweries are very popular. Little restaurants where they make their own beer. Or they used to be. I don't know if they still are. Okay, let's see. I will not conceal from you, my dear Copperfield, said Mrs. Micawber, that I think I have long felt the brewing business to be particularly adapted to Mr. Micawber. So I think she's talking about making and selling beer. Look at Barclay and Perkins. Look at Truman, Hanbury, and Buxton. It is on that extensive footing that Mr. Micawber, I know from my own knowledge of him, is calculated to shine, and profits, I am told, are enormous. But if Mr. Micawber cannot get into those firms, which decline to answer his letters when he offers his services, even in an inferior capacity, what is the use of dwelling upon the idea? None. I may have a conviction that Mr. Micawber's manners... Really, my dear, interposed Mr. Micawber. I just want to stop for a minute because we've seen this word dwell before, which means to live. So if you live in London, you can say I dwell in London. That means the same thing. I live in London. if you say, you can say, this is my house, or you can also say, this is my dwelling. You normally don't do that. You normally don't use that word dwell in regular conversation. But actually, there is a phrasal verb which is to dwell upon something or to dwell on something. And that means that something happens, an incident happens, an event happens in your life, and you cannot forget it. You're always thinking about it. You're always living in it. So if you, I dwell upon the day that I was fired from my job. Or imagine this. Oh, I can't believe I was fired from my job. I feel so horrible. If you're my friend, maybe you'll say, stop dwelling on it. Stop living in that moment. Get away from it. Move on. Do something else. It's a very useful phrasal verb, actually. Let's see. Mrs. Micawber says, what is the use of dwelling upon the idea? She's saying, why am I obsessed, always thinking about this idea? Because it never happens. My love, be silent, said Mrs. Micawber, laying her brown glove on his hand. I may have a conviction, Mr. Copperfield, that Mr. Micawber's manners peculiarly qualify him for the banking business. I may argue within myself that if I had a deposit at a banking house, the manners of Mr. Micawber, as representing the bank house, would inspire confidence and must extend connection. So now Mrs. Micawber is saying it would be good if he got a job at a bank because he has very good manners, and the people at the bank, the customers of the bank, would feel a lot of trust towards him because of his very polished manners. Irma is asking about interposed. I don't remember reading that. Where was that? Oh. I think that just means interrupted, but let's check. Again, these are not typical words. You don't really have to worry about this word interposed, but I think it means interrupted. To insert between two things, to intervene between two parties. So Davy and Mr. Copperfield, Davy and Mrs. Micawber are having a conversation, and Mr. Micawber, not physically, but he got in the middle of it. He interrupted them. That's what interpose means. But if the various banking houses refuse to avail themselves of Mr. Micawber's abilities, or receive the offer of them with what is that word? Okay, well, let's read this again. But if the various banking houses refuse to avail themselves of Mr. Micawber's abilities, or receive the offer of them with contumely, I've never seen that word before. Contumely. Wow, if you ever want to feel stupid, read Charles Dickens. Insolent, insulting. So Mr. Micawber puts in offers. He goes to these breweries and he says, can I work for you? He writes letters to banks. Can I work for you? And either they don't answer or they reply in a very rude, insulting way. That's what she's saying. What is the use of dwelling upon that idea? None. As to originating a banking business, I may know that there are members of my family who, if they chose to place their money in Mr. Micawber's hands, might found an establishment of that description. But if they do not choose to place their money in Mr. Micawber's hands, which they don't, what is the use of that? Again, I contend that we are no farther advanced than we were before. I think that Mrs. Micawber's family, her parents and her brothers and sisters, have a lot of money, because they always seem to run to her family when they're in super big trouble. And so it seems like maybe sometimes she pressures them, give him some money, let him start a bank. But they always say no, because Mr. Micawber is a nice man, but he's really horrible with money. I shook my head and said, not a bit. Traddles also shook his head and said, not a bit. What do I deduce from this? Mrs. Micawber went on to say, still with the same air of putting a case lucidly. What is the conclusion, my dear Copperfield, to which I am irresistibly brought? Am I wrong in saying, is it clear that we must live? It is clear that we must live? I answered, not at all. And Traddles answered, not at all. And I found myself afterwards sagely adding, sage means wise, so wisely adding, alone, that a person must either live or die. Just so, returned Mrs. Micawber. It is precisely that. And in fact is, my dear Mr. Copperfield, that we cannot live without something widely different from existing circumstances shortly turning up. So she's saying we can't continue living this way. We can't keep waiting for something to happen. We have to change something. Now I am convinced myself, and this I have pointed out to Mr. Micawber several times of late, that things cannot be expected to turn up. Remember, turn up is a phrasal verb that means appear, magically appear. And the Micawbers are always hoping, they're always in big financial trouble, and they always say, something will turn up. Something will magically appear. Mr. Micawber will magically get a wonderful job, or they will magically find some money. Something will turn up. Now I am convinced myself, and this I have pointed out to Mr. Micawber several times of late, that things cannot be expected to turn up of themselves. We must, in a measure, assist to turn them up. I may be wrong, but I have formed that opinion. Both Traddles and I applauded it highly. Very well, said Mrs. Micawber. Then what do I recommend? Here is Mr. Micawber with a variety of qualifications, with great talent. Really, my love, said Mr. Micawber. Pray, my dear, allow me to conclude. Here is Mr. Micawber with a variety of qualifications, with great talent, I should say, with genius. But that may be the partiality of a wife. Traddles and I both murmured no. Remember, murmured is so a murmured no is kind of like And here is Mr. Micawber, without any suitable position or employment. Where does that responsibility rest? Clearly on society. So she's blaming society that her husband doesn't have a job. Then I could make a fact so disgraceful known, and boldly challenge society to set it right. It appears to me, my dear Mr. Copperfield, said Mrs. Micawber, forcibly, that what Mr. Micawber has to do is to throw down the gauntlet and say in effect, show me who will take that up. Let the party immediately step forward. So remember, we talked about that phrase, throwing down the gauntlet means to make a challenge, to challenge someone. And Mrs. Micawber is saying, Mr. Micawber must throw down the gauntlet. He must challenge someone. Who will hire me? Who will do this for me? I ventured in the beginning, the title of this chapter is Mr. Micawber's Gauntlet. And I didn't know what a gauntlet was, so I had to look it up. So here, let me show you a picture of a gauntlet. It doesn't make any sense. It's the gloves of a knight. So a gauntlet is what a knight would have worn, 500 or 600 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, as protection. And I guess the idea of throwing down the gauntlet is, here, I will take off my protection, let's fight. I really think that's probably where it comes from. So throwing down the gauntlet is to challenge someone. I ventured to ask Miss Micawber how this was to be done. By advertising, said Mrs. Micawber, in all the papers. It seems to me that what Mr. Micawber has to do is injustice to himself, injustice to his family, and I will even go so far as to say injustice to society, by which he has been hitherto overlooked, is to advertise in the papers, to describe himself plainly, and as so-and-so, and as such qualifications. When you don't know somebody's name, this is very rude, so don't do it. You say so-and-so. Irma, this is so-and-so. So-and-so, this is Irma. That's a very insulting way to say, I don't know his name. And when you say such and such, that means I don't know exactly what. It doesn't matter what. So, how did Mrs. Micawber say that? She said, to describe himself plainly as so-and-so. So these people reading the advertisement, they don't know who he is. He's a so-and-so. It doesn't matter who he is. It's not important. And to describe his qualifications as such and such. I don't know. I can't tell you his qualifications. He can do it, but I can't. His qualifications are such and such. So it's like a fixed phrase. Now, employ me on remunerative terms and address postpaid to W.M. Post Office, Camden Town. This idea of Mrs. Micawber's, my dear Copperfield, said Mr. Micawber, making his shirt collar meet the front of his chin and glancing at me sideways. It's kind of a funny picture. Is in fact the leap to which I alluded when I last had the pleasure of seeing you. Advertising is rather expensive, I remarked dubiously. Exactly so, said Mr. Micawber, preserving the same logical air. Quite true, my dear Copperfield. I have made the identical observation to Mr. Micawber. It is for that reason especially that I think Mr. Micawber ought, as I have already said, in justice to himself, in justice to his family, in justice to society, raise a certain sum of money on a bill. So I think Mrs. Micawber is suggesting that he go in more debt. They're always in debt. They always have financial problems. It's a bad idea to do that. Mr. Micawber, leaning back in his chair, trifled with his eyeglass, and that means like played. So he's just playing with his eyeglass, not doing anything with it, and cast his eyes at the ceiling. But I thought him observant of Traddles, too, who was looking at the fire. If no member of my family, said Mrs. Micawber, is possessed of sufficient natural feeling to negotiate that bill, I believe there is a better business term to express what I mean. Mr. Micawber, with his eyes still cast up at the ceiling, suggested discount. To discount that bill, said Mrs. Micawber, then my opinion is that Mr. Micawber should go into the city, should take that bill into the money market, and should dispose of it for what he can get. I don't know exactly what this means. I guess it's just a way of raising money 200 years ago, but I'm not exactly sure what that process is that she's talking about. It's a little bit confusing to me. If the individuals in the money market oblige Mr. Micawber to sustain a great sacrifice that is between themselves and their consciences, I view it steadily as an investment. I recommend Mr. Micawber, my dear Mr. Copperfield, to do the same, to regard it as an investment, which is sure of return, and to make up his mind to any sacrifice. I felt, but I'm not sure, I don't know why, that this was self-denying and devoted in Mrs. Micawber, and I uttered a murmur to that effect. So he said, I don't know. I don't know how to do that in a way that shows that kind of feeling, but I guess some kind of sound like that. Traddles, who took his tone from me, did likewise, still looking at the fire. Maybe like, something like that. I don't know. I will not, said Mrs. Micawber, finishing her punch and gathering her scarf about her shoulders, preparatory to her withdrawal to my bedroom, I will not protect these remarks on the subject of Mr. Micawber's pecuniary affairs. At your fireside, my dear Mr. Copperfield, and in the presence of Mr. Traddles, who, though not so old a friend, is quite one of ourselves, I could not refrain from making you acquainted with the course I advise Mr. Micawber to take. I feel that the time has arrived when Mr. Micawber should exert himself, and I will add, assert himself, and it appears to me that these are the means. I am aware that I am merely a female, and that a masculine judgment is usually considered more competent to the discussion of such questions. Still, I must not forget that when I lived at home with my papa and mamma, my papa was in the habit of saying, Emma's form is fragile, but her grasp of a subject is inferior to none. So her father used to say she's very smart. That my papa was too partial, well, I well know, but he was an observer of character in some degree, and my duty and my reason equally forbid me to doubt. Irma is asking about protract. Didn't we just have that word? Doesn't protract mean to make something longer? Let's see, protract. I'm impressed that I remembered. Yeah, to take time, to make something be longer. How did they use it? Let's see. Where was it? I will not protract these remarks on the subject of Mr. Micawber's pecuniary affairs. Remember, pecuniary means financial affairs. So she's saying, I will not talk anymore. I will not talk at any more length about Mr. Micawber's finances. Irma, are you asking about the word upper? I don't even remember seeing that word here. With these words, and resisting our entreaties, that she would grace the remaining circulation of the punch with her presence, Mrs. Micawber retired to my bedroom, and really I felt that she was a noble woman, a sort of woman who might have been a Roman matron, and done all manner of heroic things in times of public trouble. In the fervor of this impression, I congratulated Mr. Micawber on the treasure he possessed. So did Traddles. So they both really admire Mrs. Micawber. So when she went into the room to get ready to leave, they said, oh, she's a wonderful woman. You're lucky to have her as a wife. Mr. Micawber extended his hand to each of us in succession, and then covered his face with his pocket handkerchief, which I think had more snuff upon it than he was aware of. And he returned to the punch in the highest state of exhilaration. He was full of eloquence. He gave us to understand... Wait, how many pages are left? Okay, I think there's still several pages left. So I have to take a 1-minute break. Okay, I'll be right back. I can't wait any longer. Okay, we're back. Thank you for waiting. Okay. He was full of eloquence. He gave us to understand that in our children we lived again, and that under the pressure of pecuniary difficulties, any accession to their number was doubly welcome. He said that Mrs. Micawber had latterly had her doubts on this point, but he had dispelled them and reassured her. As to her family, they were totally unworthy of her, and their sentiments were utterly indifferent to him, as they might, I quote his own expression, go to the devil. So that's old talk for they can go to hell. Her family can go to hell. Mr. Micawber then delivered a warm eulogy on Traddles. He said Traddles was a character, to the steady virtues of which he, Mr. Micawber, could lay no claim, but which he had thanked heaven he could admire. So they're drinking and they're toasting, to you. And so for Traddles, he says that he has a wonderful character, and Mr. Micawber could only hope to be like Traddles in character, but he never could. He feelingly alluded to the young lady unknown, whom Traddles had honored with his affection, and who had reciprocated that affection by honoring and blessing Traddles with her affection. Micawber, Irma is asking about the word allude. When you allude to something, you mention something, or you make a comment. Wow, that's really a hard word to explain. You talk about something indirectly without actually talking about it. So here, let's see. He feelingly alluded to the young lady. So he didn't mention... So Traddles is in love with a girl and he's going to marry her. But it would be a little bit impolite to mention directly the young lady. So probably he said something like... I hope you find the love of your life, or something like that. He mentioned the young lady without mentioning her. That's alluding to something. Let's see what the official definition is. I don't like mine. Let's see. To allude. To suggest something or call attention to something indirectly. To hint. So he didn't mention the young lady directly. Traddles had honored with his affection, and who had reciprocated that affection by honoring and blessing Traddles with her affection. Mr. Micawber pledged her. So did I. Traddles thanked us both by saying, with the simplicity and honesty I had a sense enough to be quite charmed with, I am very much obliged to you indeed, and I do assure you that she's the dearest girl. Mr. Micawber took an early opportunity after that of hinting, with the most delicacy and ceremony, at the state of my affections. Nothing but the serious assurance of his friend Copperfield to the contrary, he observed, could deprive him of the impression that his friend Copperfield loved and was beloved. So nobody knows that he's in love with Dora, except for Mrs. Crupp. She managed to figure it out. He didn't tell Traddles. He didn't tell Mr. Micawber. But Mr. Micawber is saying, I can see that you're in love with a girl, and there's a girl in love with you. After feeling very hot and uncomfortable for some time, and after a good deal of blushing, stammering, and denying, I said, having my glass in my hand, well, I would give them D, which so excited and gratified Mr. Micawber that he ran with a glass of punch into my bedroom in order that Mrs. Micawber might drink D. So Davy wouldn't say anything about who he was in love with. He just said, her name begins with a D. And Mr. Micawber got really excited and ran into the bedroom to tell Mrs. Micawber about D, who drank it with enthusiasm, crying from within in a shrill voice, "Hear, hear, my dear Copperfield, I'm delighted, hear," and tapping at the wall by way of applause. Our conversation afterwards took a more worldly turn, Mr. Micawber telling us that he found Camden Town inconvenient, and the first thing he contemplated doing when the advertisement should have been the cause of something satisfactory turning up was to move. He mentioned a terrace at the western end of Oxford Street, fronting Hyde Park, on which he had always had his eye, but which he did not expect to attain immediately, as it would require a large establishment, in which he should content himself with the upper part of the house, over some respectable place of business, say in Piccadilly. So all they've done, and this is the problem, Mrs. Micawber has said, put an advertisement, advertise your services, which would be very expensive. That would cost a lot of money. And they don't know even where they would get the money for that. And already Mr. Micawber is thinking of this grand place where he's going to move to after he gets a wonderful job from the advertisement. Which would be a cheerful situation for Mrs. Micawber, and where, by throwing out the bow window, or carrying up the roof another story, or making some little alteration of that sort, they might live comfortably and reputably for a few years. Whatever was reserved for him, he expressly said, or wherever his abode might be. Abode is another word for house or home. We might rely on this. There would always be a room for Traddles and a knife and a fork for me. So Mr. Micawber was saying, well, I don't know where I'll be living or how, but you can always stay with me. We acknowledged his kindness, and he begged us to forgive his having launched into these practical and businesslike details, and to excuse it as natural in one who was making entirely new arrangements in life. Mrs. Micawber, tapping at the wall, to know if tea were ready, broke up this particular phase of our friendly conversation. She made tea for us in a most agreeable manner, and when I went near her, and handing about the teacups and bread and butter, asked me, in a whisper, whether D was fair or dark. So that means, does she have light skin or darker skin? Or does she have light hair or darker hair? Or whether she was short or tall or something of that kind. Which I think I liked. After tea, we discussed a variety of topics before the fire. Mr. Micawber was good enough to sing for us, in a small, thin, flat voice, which I remembered to have considered when I first knew her. Oh, Mrs. Micawber. Mrs. Micawber was good enough to sing for us. In a small, thin, flat voice, which I remembered to have considered when I first knew her. The very table bare of acoustics. The favorite ballads of the Dashing White Sergeant. Dashing, maybe you don't know this, but dashing could mean like handsome for a man. So maybe you could use it for a woman too. It's mostly used for men, I think, though. You look dashing. That means you look very handsome. The Dashing White Sergeant. The Little Tafflin. For both of these songs, Mrs. Micawber had been famous when she lived at home with her papa and mamma. Mr. Micawber told us that when he heard her sing for the first time on the first occasion of his seeing her breath The paternal roof. Beneath, my goodness, I'm getting tired. This is a long chapter. Let me read that again. On the first occasion of seeing her beneath the paternal roof, she had attracted his attention in an extraordinary degree. But that when it came to little Tiflin, he had resolved to win that woman or perish in the attempt. It was between 10 and 11 o'clock when Mrs. Micawber rose to replace her cap in the whitey brown paper parcel and to put on her bonnet. Mr. Micawber took the opportunity of Traddles putting on his greatcoat to slip a letter into my hand with a whispered request that I would read it at my leisure. So when they were getting ready to leave, Mr. Micawber, when nobody was looking, gave Davy a note and said, "Read it later." I also took the opportunity of my holding a candle over the banisters to light them down. When Mr. Micawber was going first, leading Mrs. Micawber, and Traddles was following with the cap, to detain Traddles for a moment on the top stairs. "Traddles," said I, "Mr. Micawber don't mean any harm, poor fellow, but if I were you, I wouldn't lend him anything." So he's saying Mr. Micawber is a nice person, but don't give him any money. "My dear Copperfield," returned Traddles, smiling, "I haven't got anything to lend." "You have got a name, you know," said I. "Oh, you call that something to lend?" returned Traddles with a thoughtful look. "Certainly." "Oh," said Traddles, "yes, to be sure. I'm very much obliged to you, Copperfield, but I'm afraid I have lent him that already." "For the bill that is to be a certain investment?" I inquired. "No," said Traddles, "not for that one. This is the first I have heard of that one. I have been thinking that he will most likely propose that one on my way home. Mine's another." So Traddles is saying, I can't give him any money. I don't have any money. And Davy's saying, "But you have your name, you have your reputation. Don't let him use your name or your reputation for anything." And Traddles says, "Well, that's too late. I already did that." Mr. Micawber, looking up at this juncture to where we were standing, I had only time to repeat my caution. Traddles thanked me and descended, but I was much afraid, when I observed the good-natured manner in which he went down with the cap in his hand, and he gave Mrs. Micawber his arm, that he would be carried into the money market neck and heels. I returned to my fireside and was musing. That means like thinking about something. Half gravely and half laughing. On the character of Mr. Micawber and the old relations between us, when I heard a quick step ascending the stairs. At first I thought it was Traddles coming back for something Mrs. Micawber had left behind, but as the step approached, I knew it. I felt my heart beat high, the blood rushed to my face, for it was Steerforth's. I was never unmindful of Agnes. She never left that sanctuary in my thoughts, if I may call it so, where I had placed her from the first. So Agnes was became kind of like a sister to Davy. When he was going to school, he stayed in a room of a lawyer, the house of a lawyer, and the lawyer has a daughter named Agnes, and they became very, very good friends. He lived there for maybe 10 years, and she became like a sister to him. And when she met Steerforth, later she told Davy, and Davy trusts her very much. She said, "He's not a good person. You shouldn't spend time with him. I get a bad feeling from him." And Davy said, "You're crazy." But he's always thinking about that. Like, why does she think that about him? So, okay, let's see what happens. But when he entered and stood before me with his hand out in the darkness and had fallen on him The darkness that had fallen on him changed to light, and I felt confounded. Confounded means confused, and ashamed of having doubted one I loved so heartily. I loved her none the less, so he loves Steerforth very much, but he also loves Agnes very much. I thought of her as the same benignant, gentle angel in my life. I reproached myself. Remember, reproach says, you're doing something bad. Don't do that. That's bad. So he's reproaching himself. He's saying, stop doing that. Don't do that. I reproached myself, not her, with having done him an injury, and I would have made him any atonement if I had known what to make and how to make it. Why, Daisy, old boy, dumbfoundered, laughed Steerforth, shaking my hand heartily and throwing it gaily away. Have I detected you in another feast? You sybarite! These Doctors' Commons fellows are the gayest men in town, I believe, and beat us sober Oxford people all to nothing. His bright glance went merrily round the room. So Steerforth is saying, Davy, another dinner party? He's only had two. The one with Steerforth when he first moved, and this one. But it seems like Steerforth is only around when there's a party. His bright glance went merrily round the room, and he took the seat on the sofa opposite me, which Mrs. Micawber had recently vacated, and stirred the fire into a blaze. I was so surprised at first, said I, giving him welcome with all the cordiality I could, that I had hardly breath to greet you with, Steerforth. Well, the sight of me is good for sore eyes, as the Scotch say, replied Steerforth, and so is the sight of you, Daisy, in full bloom. How are you, my bacchanal? I am very well, said I, and not at all bacchanalian tonight, though I confess to another party of three, all of whom I met in the street, talking loud in your praise, returned Steerforth. Who's our friend in the tights? I gave him the best idea I could in a few words of Mr. Micawber. He laughed heartily at my feeble portrait of that gentleman, and said he was a man to know, and he must know him. But who do you suppose the other friend is? Said I, in my turn. Heaven knows, Steerforth. Not a bore, I hope. I thought he looked a little like one. Traddles, I replied triumphantly. Who's he? Asked Steerforth in a careless way. So all three of those boys went to school together, and they even slept in the same room together, but Steerforth doesn't remember who he is. Who's he? Asked Steerforth in a careless way. Don't you remember Traddles in our room at Salem House? Oh, that fellow, said Steerforth, beating a lump of coal out of the top of the fire with a poker. Is he as soft as ever? And where the deuce did you pick him up from? So it seems like Steerforth doesn't care. Not at all. I extolled Traddles in reply, as highly as I could, for I felt that Steerforth rather slighted him, Steerforth dismissing the subject with a light nod and a smile, and the remark that he would be glad to see the old fellow too, for he had always been an odd fish, inquired if I could give him anything to eat. During most of his short dialogue, when he had not been speaking in a wild, vivacious manner, he had sat idly, beating the lump of coal with the poker. I observed that he did the same thing while I was getting out the remains of the pigeon pie, and so forth. Why, Daisy, here's a supper for a king, he exclaimed, starting out of his silence with a burst, and taking his seat at the table. I shall do it justice, for I have come from Yarmouth. I thought you'd come from Oxford, I returned. No, not I, said Steerforth. I've been seafaring. Seafaring means going out on a boat. Better employed. Litimer was here today to inquire for you, I remarked, And I understood him that you were at Oxford, though. Now I think of it, he certainly did not say so. So now remember, Yarmouth is the place where Davy spent many times of his childhood. And one time he invited Steerforth to come with him. And now suddenly Steerforth is spending time in Yarmouth. Littimer is a greater fool than I thought him to have been, inquiring for me at all, said Steerforth, jovially pouring out a glass of wine and drinking to me. And to understanding him, you are a cleverer fellow than most of us, Daisy, if you can do that. That's true indeed, said I, moving my chair to the table. So you've been at Yarmouth, Steerforth? Interested to know all about it. Have you been there long? No, he returned. An escapade. An escapade is like a short, fun time. An escapade of a week or two. A week or so. And how are they all? Of course, little Emily is not married yet. Not yet. Going to be, I believe. In so many weeks or months or something or other. I have not seen much of them, by the by, he said. His knife and fork, which he had been using with great diligence, and began feeling in his pockets. I have a letter for you. From whom? Why, from your old nurse. He returned, taking some papers out of his breast pocket. J. Steerforth, Esquire, debtor to the willing mind. That's not it. Patience. We'll find it presently. Old what's-his-name, in a bad way, and it's about that, I believe. See, do you remember earlier we said you could call someone so-and-so? That's very disrespectful. Hey, this is so-and-so. Or so-and-so down in the corner told me that the store was robbed. I don't know. You say so-and-so when you don't know a person's name. But it's a really disrespectful thing to do. Even more disrespectful would be to say, what's his name? Or what's her name? That's a very rude way of saying, I don't know that person's name and I don't really care. So this is extremely insensitive because Peggotty is like Davy's grandmother. And he introduced Peggotty to her now husband, Barkis, who's a very nice man, a very quiet but a very, very nice man, and who has been extremely sick. And Davy really loves Peggotty, and she really loves him. And so Steerforth is saying, where's that letter? I don't know, some letter about what's his name dead or something like that. So Mr. Barkis died, and Steerforth is saying it in a very the word is callous. He's saying it in a very callous way. Callous means I don't care. So let's read that again. We'll find it presently. Oh, what's his name is in a bad way, and it's about that, I believe. Barkis, do you mean? That's Peggotty's husband. Yes, still feeling in his pockets, looking over their contents. It's all over with this poor Barkis, I'm afraid. So maybe he's not dead, but he's about to die. I saw a little apothecary there. Apothecary is a pharmacy. Surgeon or whatever he is. Or a pharmacist. Who brought you... Sorry, I'm just looking for my glasses. I thought maybe my glasses were here. My eyes are getting tired. They're not. Oh, we'll keep going. Okay, let's see. Who brought your worship into the world? He was mighty learned about the case to me, but the upshot of his opinion was that the carrier was making his last journey rather fast. Put your hand into the breast of the pocket of my great coat, on the chair yonder. Yonder means over there, but it's not really used in modern English too much. And I think you'll find the letter. Is it there? So Steerforth is saying, I ran into a doctor or a pharmacist, and he said, oh yeah, Mr. Barkis, he's almost gone. But he's saying this in a very insensitive way. Here it is, said I. That's right. It was from Peggotty. Something less legible than usual. Legible means I can read it. If something is illegible, that means it's impossible to read. If something is legible, it means you can read it. But if Davy is saying the letter is... Peggotty, she can't write very well. So it's not easy to read her writing, usually. But he's saying this is less legible. It's really difficult for him to read this letter. Something less legible than usual, and brief. It informed me that her husband's of her husband's hopeless state, and hinted at his being a little nearer than heretofore, meaning he's closer to death than he was before, and consequently more difficult to manage for his own comfort. These are all very polite ways. He's close to death, and he's in a lot of pain. It said nothing of her weariness. Weary means being tired and sad, or just tired. It said nothing of her weariness and watching, and praised him highly. It was written with a plain, unaffected, homely piety that I knew to be genuine, and ended with, "My duty to my ever-darling," meaning myself. While I deciphered it, Steerforth continued to eat and drink. "It's a bad job," he said, when I had done. "But the sun sets every day, and people die every minute, and we mustn't be scared by the common lot. If we fail to hold our own, because that equal foot at all men's doors was heard knocking somewhere, every object in this world would slip from us. No, ride on roughshod, if need be, smooth-shod, if that will do. But ride on over all the obstacles, and win the race." "And win what race?" said I. "The race that has started in," said "Ride on." I remember as he paused, looking at me, his handsome head, a little thrown back, and his glass raised in his hand, that though the freshness of the sea wind was on his face, and it was ruddy, and there were traces in it made since I last saw it, as if it had been applied to himself, to some habitual strain of fervent energy, which when roused was so passionately roused within him, I had it in my thoughts to remonstrate with him upon his desperate way of pursuing any fancy he took, such as this buffeting of rough seas and braving the hard weather, for example, when my mind glanced off to the immediate subject of our conversation again, and pursued that instead. Oh, that's a very complicated paragraph. But Davy is looking at his face, and he can see that he's been out in the sea. His skin looks rough and red from the weather. And when he noticed that, he was about to tell Steerforth, you better stop fooling around like this, doing all these crazy things that you do. But then suddenly he remembered about Peggotty and Barkis, and he directed, instead of talking about Steerforth's adventures, he changed the subject back to Barkis and Peggotty. They are potent spirits, and will do whatever you like," he answered, moving from the table to the fireside again. "Then I will tell you what, Steerforth, I think I will go down and see my old nurse. It is not that I can do her any good or render her any real service, but she is so attached to me, and that my visit will have as much effect on her as I could hope to do as I could do both. She will take it so kindly. That it will be a comfort and a support to her. It is no great effort to make, I am sure, for such a friend as she has been made to me. Wouldn't you go a day's journey if you were in my place?" His face was thoughtful, and he sat considering it a little bit before he answered, in a low voice, "Well, go. You can do no harm." "You've just come back," said I. "And would it be in vain to ask you to go with me?" "Quite," he returned. "I am for Highgate tonight. I have not seen my mother this long time, and it lies upon my conscience, for it's something to be loved as she loves her prodigal son." "Bah! Nonsense! You mean to go tomorrow, I suppose," he said, holding me out at arm's length with a hand on each of my shoulders. "Yes, I think so." "Well then, don't go till next day. I wanted you to come and stay a few days with us. Here I am on purpose to bid you, and you fly off to Yarmouth." "You're a nice fellow to talk of flying off, Steerforth, who are always running wild on some unknown expedition or other." He looked at me for a moment without speaking, and then rejoined, still holding me as before, and giving me a shake. "Come! Say the next day, and pass as much of tomorrow as you can with us. Who knows when we may meet again? Else, come, say the next day. I want you to stand between Rosa Dartle and me and keep us asunder. Keep us apart. Separate us." "Yes, or hate," laughed Steerforth. "Oh, wait. Would you love each other too much without me?" "Yes, or hate," laughed Steerforth. "No matter which. Come, say next day." So Davy wants to go immediately tomorrow to see Peggotty. And Steerforth is saying, "No, you have to at least spend one day with me. Come to my home. And leave the next day." I said the next day, and he put on his greatcoat and lighted his cigar and set off to walk home. Finding him in this intention, I put on my own greatcoat, but did not light my own cigar, having had enough of that for one while, and walked with him as far as the open road, a dull road, and then at night. He was in great spirits. That means he was very happy all the way. And when we parted, and I looked after him going so gallantly and airily homeward, I thought of his saying, "Ride on over all obstacles and win the race," and wished for the first time that he had some worthy race to run. So Davy's kind of noticing Steerforth never really does anything, nothing important. Maybe he's not so great. I was undressing in my own room when Mr. Micawber's letter tumbled onto the floor. Thus reminded of it, I broke the seal and read it as follows. It was dated an hour and a half before dinner. I'm not sure whether I have mentioned that when Mr. Micawber was at any particularly desperate crisis, he used a sort of legal phraseology, which he seemed to think equivalent to winding up his affairs. "Sir, for I dare not say my dear Copperfield, it is expedient that I should inform you that the undersigned is crushed. To be crushed means to feel devastated, to have your heart broken. Some flickering of efforts to spare you the premature knowledge of this calamitous position you may observe in him this day, but hope has sunk beneath the horizon, and the undersigned is crushed." So all this means is I'm in a very bad situation and my heart is broken. The present communication is penned within the personal range, I cannot call it the society of an individual, in a state closely bordering on intoxication. So he's a little drunk. Employed by a broker. That individual is in legal possession of the premises under a distress for rent. His inventory includes not only the chattels and effects of every description belonging to the undersigned as yearly tenant of this inhabitation, but also those appertaining to Mr. Thomas Traddles, lodger, a member of the Honorable Society of Temple. So Mr. Micawber owes somebody money. And this person has gone, and if I understand this correctly, because like I said, it's very difficult to understand what Mr. Micawber is saying. But I think he's saying that as they're at dinner tonight, somebody is taking possession of the building where Mr. Micawber lives, and that includes all the possessions of Traddles. Irma's asking about the word penned. Well, the pen is something that you write with, and to pen something means to write something. So penned just means written. Where did they use that? Penned. I can't see it. Oh, I don't really see it here. It just means written. Sorry, I can't find it. I think I'm getting tired. All right, let's see. If any drop of gloom were wanting in the overflowing cup, which is now commended in the language of an immortal writer to the lips of the undersigned, it would be found in the fact that a friendly acceptance granted to the undersigned by the before-mentioned Mr. Thomas Traddles for the sum of 231 for... These are amounts of money. Okay, I think that's 4 shillings, and I don't know. I can't... it's really old money, and I don't... Let's just say 231 pounds. I don't even know if it's pounds. That's a lot of money if it's pounds. And is not provided for. Also, in fact, the living responsibilities clinging to the undersigned will, in the course of nature, be increased by the sum of one more helpless victim, whose miserable appearance may be looked for in round numbers at the expiration of a period not exceeding 6 lunar months from the present date. I'm not really sure what he's saying. After premising thus much, it would be a work of supereration to add that dust and ashes are forever scattered on the head of Mr. Wilkins Micawber. Yeah, because look at the next paragraph. Poor Traddles. I knew enough of Mr. Micawber by this time to foresee that he might be expected to recover the blow, but my night's rest was sorely distressed by thoughts of Traddles. So Mr. Micawber owes a lot of money, and somebody has legally taken possession of the building where they're staying, and that includes all of Traddles' possessions. My night's rest was sorely distressed by thoughts of Traddles and the curate's daughter, who was one of 10 down in Devonshire, and who was such a dear girl, and who would wait for Traddles, ominous praise, until she was 60, or any age that could be mentioned. Okay. Well, that was the end of chapter 28. A pretty long chapter. But, so next time we will look into chapter 29. I visit Steerforth at his home again. All right. Well, thank you, everyone who stayed and watched until the end. And thank you for all of your questions and comments while I was reading. I really appreciate it. And I hope that you come back when we do chapter 29. I'll try to do it tomorrow. We'll have to see. I've got a lot of things to do tomorrow, but hopefully we'll do it tomorrow at the same time. Okay? So I'll see you again hopefully tomorrow. Okay? Goodbye.